say we're back or.
Okay. So welcome back to the Google Hangout on the Risk and Opportunity MOOC with Norman Loaiza, Cesar Calderon, Stefan Allegat, and myself, Kyla Whitley. I wanted to move on to one of the questions that was actually asked by many people and has also been a topic of great discussion on the discussion forum this week. Maybe, Norman, you can start off with an answer on this one, which is about corruption as an obstacle to risk management. So, for example, Patricia Chan asks, how much of an impact does corruption and failure of government have on risk management, and what can be done to improve it?
Well, corruption is bad for society and especially bad for risk management because it leads to waste of resources. And we know how important resources are to manage risk. Second, because it leads to wrong incentives and distorted incentives for action. And number three, because it redistributes wealth to those who are in power, making people that are already vulnerable even more so. So maybe to give you an example of how corruption affects risk management, let's just consider the case of traffic transit police that instead of implementing the rules, they actually take bribes so that people can keep breaking the rules. I think we are all familiar with that, especially in developing countries, and that happens very often. That is, you break the rule, you violate the traffic law, police catches you, and then you pay a bribe. Well, what that leads to is an environment where it's very dangerous, actually, to drive. It's very dangerous to be on a road, and it becomes this sort of behavior becomes a danger for you as a driver and for everyone else that is around you. And it's corruption which is making this so dangerous and hard to manage. But we need to ask why there is corruption. Maybe in order to understand this, I will keep with the example. In this example, it may be that fines, that regular fines for traffic violations, are just incredibly expensive. Say, for instance, for just a minor traffic violation, you would have to pay the same as your weekly salary. Then, if the policeman offers you to get free, if you just pay him a fraction of it, then you may be tempted to do that. So corruption occurs when, on the one hand, business and other types of regulations are just very burdensome. And when the law is not applicable in a way that suits the realities of the country. So we really need to wonder about how appropriate laws and regulations are in different situations. And by making them streamlined, by making them transparent, we can fight corruption and with that improve its management.
Well, talking a little bit about the problem of incentives, you can think about corrupt governments to the extent that they, instead of maximizing the welfare of their citizens, they maximize their own utility function. You can think about situations of countries that are commodity exporters. What happens whenever they receive a windfall because of terms of trade gains? What will happen is that instead of countries saving or redistributing that money to their citizens with better public services, what they will do is going to be spend their money in things that are, and in goods or in services that are not the ones that the citizens may need, or distribute that money between them and their lobby groups.
So let's move on to the next question, which is really about how to overcome obstacles, corruption being one of them. And another one that is common and which is discussed in this week's lectures is behavioral failures. So Stefan, maybe you can answer this question from Sunita, who asks, there are many examples, can we provide examples of countries who've improved their risk management by systematically changing their behavior?
Well,
First, I think the two questions are very much related because corruption, in a way, is a behavioral failure. And we can see the role of behaviors and social norms in how corruption is possible and accepted or not. And you can see very clearly that in some countries, it's socially unacceptable to propose to bribe or to ask for a bribe. And in some countries, it's perfectly okay, and that's something that you can do without any like shame or problem. So the two questions, I think, are very much related. And in countries where corruption has been reduced a lot, it's also because it became unacceptable socially to ask for a bribe or to try to give a bribe. So this kind of change in social norms and behaviors is also, I mean, a component of the fight against corruption. If we want to look at examples of cases where we had very big changes with very positive outcomes, I think that the main example is in public health and how hygiene, for instance, became something that is just normal, the thing to do. And it was not so much about policies trying to create incentives to make people have these rules of hygienic rules and so on. It's not a fiscal policy. It's not all these like economic instruments. It's a lot of education, a lot of communication, and understanding why are people not doing what is in their best interests, and trying to just target these obstacles. So looking at the case of sanitation, for instance, the international community started by providing infrastructure like public toilets and so on in villages with very mixed results. And I mean, until these investments in terms of money and resources and infrastructure was complemented with behavioral intervention, trying to understand what in society is an obstacle for people to using these places, what kind of instruments can be implemented. So we have, for instance, this competition in Indian villages about sanitation to just make people talk about it and make these kind of behaviors becomes a norm. And when you get that, the shift can be very quick, very rapid, and very, very efficient. Another example is for early warning systems and evacuation, taking the case of Bangladesh, for instance, where at first, each time a hurricane affected Bangladesh, we had, I mean, human losses in the hundreds of thousands. It's really, really terrible. And in like a few decades, first investments have been made in early warning systems, evacuation and shelters, but also a lot of communication has been made on the ground with local people going from houses to explain why these forecasts of hurricanes were, why they should be trusted. And only because they had this human contact and all this work at the very local level, people started to trust warnings, started to evacuate when asked to do so. And today, Bangladesh is still extremely vulnerable, but the number of deaths has been reduced maybe by a few hundred. So it's a big success, and it's a combination, again, of investment and behavioral intervention. And that's probably the most efficient way to target some of these problems for risk management.
So I wanted to take things to the macro level now, and in the report and in the discussions in the MOOC, we have many examples of these kind of opportunities that come with a lot of risk as well. So Cesar, maybe in terms of the macroeconomy, you can answer a question by Ibad-ur-Rahman Ahmed, who asks, what emerging economies can do to protect themselves from the volatility in global financial systems, while at the same time encouraging globalization for development? So how to grow and be integrated without being impacted too much by global financial crises?
Well, I mean, one of the trends that we have observed over the last 20 years is that the increasing globalization, not only in terms of finance, not only in terms of trade, but also in terms of finance in the world. And as countries become more integrated to the world economy, of course, they're going to be more susceptible to external shocks. I mean, of course, what we have been saying in the WDR is that countries have to assume some risks and assume some educated risks. And for that, you know, there are a wide array of instruments or policies that countries can adopt in order to protect themselves from the increasing volatility. If you think about countries that either face terms of trade shocks or countries that face external financial shocks or sudden stops. There are different measures that can go from self-protective measures to self-insurance measures to market insurance measures. Of course, not every country is going to have access to all these different types of instruments, but these different types of instruments can help them protect. And I'm going to give some examples to make this clear. Like, for instance, let's say that there is a real shock coming from abroad. Having a flexible exchange rate arrangement, for instance, will allow countries to adjust to current account imbalances. Trade diversification is something that will allow countries, or moving up the quality ladder in their production, in their export activities, will allow countries also to protect from terms of trade shocks or interest rate shocks. Financial diversification, in the sense that countries may have a good portfolio of, say, debt and equity instruments, will allow them also not to be too vulnerable in case that the stock market worldwide falls down, because you have not only you have an equity asset, but also you have a debt asset. No, in terms of self-insurance, I mean, emerging markets, what they typically do is accumulate reserves. Central banks have, and this is something that central banks have experienced in the wake of the Asian crisis. If you look, I mean, maybe it's the outcome of that there's an insufficient menu of global saving instruments, that central banks in emerging markets have started accumulating reserves, and they use it as a chest to protect themselves against vulnerability in the financial market. And if I think about another instrument, would be like a market insurance instrument. You have a lot of contingent instruments, like, for instance, instruments that can hedge you, or hedging instruments against terms of trade volatility, or hedging instruments against stocks. Like, for instance, you can think about all these VIX-linked contracts that would help you protect against a science stock.
So, in other words, the solution is not to prevent the country from being integrated, but to manage the risk of integration.
Exactly.
A, through sort of protecting yourself through diversification to limit the magnitude, and B, to having insurance options in case it happens.
And I guess it means also that there is, in many cases, a transition that in your opening process, you have to make sure through your opening process you build progressively all this foundation for risk management that you need to manage the shock you're making yourself vulnerable to. So it makes economic policy much more complicated, because you have to make sure you have a balanced portfolio of risk-taking and innovation on the one hand, and like risk management instruments on the other hand.
And in some cases, we see that countries want to have particular instruments such as capital controls to try and manage this transition without being too exposed to it. Right? So on the topic of insurance, actually, I don't know, maybe Norman or Cesar, you both want to say something, but we have a question from Catherine Ballaton, who says, insurance is a very important risk management tool, but people are often not aware of it. So what can be done to encourage people to obtain insurance? And particularly, how can it be accessible for poor people who may not have money to pay very high premiums?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing that you have to do, I mean, as a government or as an institution that wants to somehow promote insurance, is provide information. They're like how you would financial literacy campaigns. There's a lot of evidence, not only on the size of insurance, but also on the issue of access to finance, that shows that granting access to these financial services can improve the welfare of citizens. The report has examples, for instance, about rainfall insurance in India, how the provision of rainfall insurance allowed Indian farmers to diversify, to have high yield crops in their portfolio, and to also invest in things like fertilizers. There's also evidence, interesting evidence. I think it's also in the case of water connections in emerging markets, where basically what you do is you have a well, and all the people in the community goes to a well. And there are private companies that offer you a private connection. But of course, people don't have money to pay for that private connection. And what they decide to do, an experiment where we're gonna give people a zero interest loan for 7 years, so they can pay for the private connection. And they show that the improvement in terms of sanitation and in terms of hygiene is huge.
Well, I think I should point out that poor people do insure themselves, but they mostly do it by what we call in the course and in the report self-insurance. They save, and they take a number of actions in view of the possibility of loss in the future. And let me give you one simple example that I think we will all be are familiar with. In many developing countries, parents, especially in rural areas, have lots of kids. And there are many reasons why they make this choice. But one of them is that they are taking some sort of insurance against the risk of old age without income. They know that by having many kids, at least some of them will be able to help them out when they are old. That's a form of insurance. Now, it's not a very effective way in many cases because there are markets that are missing. And I think Cesar's answer goes to that point, that the government and the financial system can play a role by providing these markets at reasonable prices. But then the question is are these markets viable, and are prices, or could prices be low enough? And the main issue to consider in this point is whether moral hazard can be overcome. Moral hazard is a big obstacle for insurance markets, because then it becomes too expensive to provide this sort of insurance if it leads to bad behavior on the part of those who have purchased the insurance. So there are ways, and technology is allowing companies and governments to monitor people to prevent this moral hazard from occurring. And that is making markets possible, and it's lowering prices so that people have more access. But before I drop this point, I would advise members of the audience to read this book by Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo, two professors at MIT. The book is Poor Economics, and it shows many of the strategies that the poor use to insure themselves against all sorts of risks. Right? So it's a great book, and I recommend it.
So, and the one thing I wanted to add, in addition to sort of traditional mechanisms and market innovations, is also some community innovation. So, to the extent that savings is a means of insuring yourself, we do see some innovations at the community level with saving societies and groups that can help to protect people. As we'll discuss in week 3, this tends to help mostly with idiosyncratic shocks within the community, and so the big systemic shocks are still a problem.
If I can just add one thing, if we want to make insurance work, it also needs to be in a package of risk management solutions. In the report, we insist a lot on the existence of these 4 blocks: knowledge, protection, insurance, and coping. And if you want insurance to be cheap enough, accessible, and useful, it can work only if you're also doing your work in the other components. So the knowledge should be there because it's the basics for insurance, but also protection. If you take places where very little is done in terms of protection, basically the risk is so high and so frequent that insurance is not a solution. Only if you have protection to take care of the very repeated and frequent risks, then you can use insurance for the other layers of risks. But insurance cannot take care of all the risks for all frequencies and all intensity of risk. It's one part of your strategy. And I think in many cases, insurance doesn't work because the other components are missing. Not so much because insurance is not there, just because you don't have the knowledge you need or you don't have the protection you need.
So I wanted to come back to, we spoke a bit about before about overcoming obstacles in order to improve risk management. And Stefan, maybe you can take this question from Dirk de Boer, who notes that one of the problems with risk management is that it requires long-run investments, but people tend to have short memories. So there's this time tension. So what can be done to create incentives for more of a long-term focus?
Well, I think it's a very, very important point. And the lack of incentive is linked to this memory issue, but not only. I mean, if you live in a city and you have the mayor of the city doing a great job in managing flood risks, for instance, so the guy is doing a serious job and is preventing urbanization in places that are too dangerous and so on. 30 years later, you have a big storm arriving, and many lives are saved because your mayor did a good job 30 years before. I mean, who will go back to the guy who did a great job to just reward him for the good job and to tell him that it was good? It's not only a question of memory, it's also a question of the fact that when you avoid losses, I mean, avoided losses cannot be seen, so nobody can observe them, and it creates, again, a lack of incentive to just do risk management. There is no easy solution to this problem, but one of the things we're working on, for instance, right now is try to create indicators to measure how risk management is good and effective, so that if someone stays 5 years as a mayor of a city, at the end of a 5-year period, we can basically give a score, how good the job was done in terms of risk management, just to make sure if the mayor is trying to get reelected, for instance, the voters know if risk management was done properly or not. So this might be based on risk audits, where after 5 years you look at the change in risk exposure. But you need to take the long-term impact and to create a short-term incentive out of that. And creating good indicators and good metrics for risk might be an option to do that. The other thing we observe is the role of civil society. If you take health problems for tobacco or lead paint or things like this, associations, civil organizations played a huge role to just put forward these problems and to force policymakers and decision makers to take the problem seriously and to fight the lobbies that are making money out of creating risks for others. So in countries with a very active civil societies, with the ability to organize beneficiaries from risk management, in most cases we get a much better risk management.
It pushes governments to take a more long-term focus.
Yeah, and that is really only if you can organize yourself. Because if you're looking at industrial risks, for instance, industrials will be organized to try to protect their position. People suffering from air pollution or water pollution, they are not organized. They're just people living around the river or the groundwater. So you need an association of these people to just have a voice and be able to talk to policymakers and decision makers and create this debate that you need to make decisions about risk management.
So,
if I may just complement Stefan's answer by highlighting the importance of setting up institutions that transcend the political cycle. In many cases, investments have this short-term focus because they follow very much the very limited, sometimes myopic agenda of people in power. But if institutions can transcend those cycles, then they can have a larger role in promoting investments in the long run. And one example of those institutions is central banks. I think central banks have achieved, and Cesar may want to comment on this, a great victory in defeating hyperinflation. In the majority of countries now, hyperinflation is a thing of the past. And the most important reason for this was the creation of autonomous central banks with a very clear mandate.
So, and this is something we'll come to in the fourth week of the course, is sort of what institutions, what reforms can we put in place to try and make some of those changes happen. So I wanted to take one more question from the ones we received in advance, and it's also one that many people asked, which is about the particular difficulties of managing risk in fragile and conflict affairs say. So, for example, Arhan Hassan Haji says, given the complexity and uncertainty in such environments, how do we develop effective risk management systems when the community is fragmented, cohesion and trust is low, government and institutions are weak or don't exist, and there's high level of vested interest? So when all the odds are against you, what can be done?
This is a tough question, and in presentations around the world, we have been asked that question, which can be summarized like this: what do you do when almost nothing works? And the answer that we give in the report is the following: that in that case, you really need to focus on what is most important and where you can be the most productive. So in our framework for risk management in the report and in the course is one that calls for different action from different sectors and systems in the economy, from the household to the international community. So in situations of dire conditions, when there is fragility, where there is war, where there is lack of trust, you really need to set your priorities straight. In the case of governments, they should just worry about safety and macroeconomic stability. Those very important steps, minimal steps, but that will create the right environment for other systems in the economy and in society to come in and function properly. And it was 20 years ago since the horrible genocide in Rwanda. And I think in 1994, after the genocide, many people thought there is nothing that can be done in this country, nothing will work out. And 20 years later, we see a country that has grown quite substantially. In 2008, in fact, they had a record growth of almost 12% in the year. And poverty has been reduced, and many things are starting to work out properly. And the main reason for this is that there were a system of reforms that concentrated the workings, the functioning of government to macroeconomic stability and to personal and social safety. And there are many things that happen in between. I know that many of them are controversial. One of these controversial issues is the political regime. But just focusing the energies on where the most important constraints, I think, contributed to making a very desperate situation one of viability and even long-run sustainability.
And to add on that, I think we also call for simple solutions in places where things are not functioning well and resources are low. Sometimes something that is far from perfect but is simple to implement might be the right option. And I mean, I don't want to appear naive, but we also have evidence that sometimes in situations of conflicts and lack of trust, risk management might be just one entry point to rebuild trust and confidence. So if you look at water management, for instance, many people are talking about conflicts around water. But if you look at all the interactions among countries, 90% of the case, water management is one reason why countries collaborate and exchange and discuss. And it's much more a driver of collaboration than a driver of conflicts. Conflicts do exist, but it's also maybe one entry point to restart a dialogue when the cohesion is low and the conflictuality is very high. So risk management can be also used as a tool to just recreate this trust.
So let's take a couple of questions that are coming in live, and there's some interesting ones. So one is about what to do when people simply don't want to take the measures to improve their risk management. So the example is from Senegal, and people live in this area that gets affected very much by flooding on a continual basis. So, but they don't want to move. So what can you do in these situations where maybe the problem is not knowledge, but behavior?
So, I mean, my first answer would be not to assume that people are wrong and that like experts are right. If people do not want to move, it's very likely they have very good reasons to do that. And only if you understand why they are willing to stay, you can understand if you need to do something about it and what you need to do about it. In many, many cities in the developing world, we see people creating informal settlements in places that are extremely dangerous because of landslides or floods. And they do that not because they don't care. They do that because that's the only way they can settle in cities where they have a lot of new opportunities, like access to services and schools and jobs that are paying better than in rural areas and so on. And they're ready to take the risk because the benefits are there. So if you want to prevent them from going into these places, it's not by trying to build barriers and to prevent them to go there. It's by creating the same opportunities in safe places. So in that example, maybe people settle in flood zones because they have no choice to access jobs and services. And the only way around that is to create new developments in safe places with the same access, which means good transportation to job centers, which means good schools and sanitation and drinking water. So you provide services where it's safe to settle, and people will go there. People are smart. If they have a choice between risky places and safe places with the same opportunities, they will go to the safe places. But the short answer is, when people act strangely, first really ask yourself why they are doing that and whether there are good reasons to do that. Sometimes people are doing the wrong things, sometimes, but very often they are doing what's best for themselves.
Well, I think Stefan is absolutely right in pointing out the need to understand why people behave in certain ways. And Stefan's answer is sort of the good cop answer. So let me give you the bad cop answer. Well, the bad cop answer is that people need to face the consequences of their actions as well. And many times they take risks because they know that they will be rescued. And it happens with large institutions like banks, and it also happens with people that are facing the risk of flooding. They may expect that if there is a flood, that they will be rescued, they will be given a different facility, a reconstructed house, and so on. So sometimes, and this may sound harsh, because I'm playing the role of a bad cop now, people need to face the consequences of their actions.
So another question is about insurance at the national level. So we talked a lot about individuals and the insurance that they can take, but one of our questioners is pointing out that, you know, oftentimes the risks that countries face are not just at the individual level, but at the national level and sometimes even at the regional level. So how can we think of pools of insurance to help countries or communities, macro entities, and not just micro individuals?
Well, the first line of defense for many countries is the accumulation of reserves, as we said earlier in the hangout, no? In this conversation. Countries will accumulate reserves. Of course, I mean, there could be, as you just clearly pointed out, systemic shocks that can, you know, go beyond the capacity to respond of the country. In that case, you have a lot of examples where there are regional pools, or you have also regional swap arrangements. For instance, you can think about the Chiang Mai initiative in Asia, or you have also other entities that work in that way that you would think like the FLAR, which is the Latin American Reserve Fund, where basically countries are pooling some percentage of the reserves in case there is a shock that will affect one of the countries within that. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, as we were saying before, I mean, you also can engage in contingent lending. Lending that will activate in case there is a specific event that happens. You also have institutions like the International Monetary Fund, which could play a role as an international lender of last resort in the case that the country doesn't have the resources to stay above any shock, or if the regional pool doesn't. or the green pool doesn't exist. You have the International Monetary Fund as an institution that can help. The World Bank during the last crisis has also helped with the development policy lending, because most of the development policy lending has been devoted to budget support. So basically to provide some resources to government to conduct countercyclical.
Just a couple of words on this important issue. I think countries should look beyond regional agreements. And why do I say this? Because in many cases, countries in the same region face similar shocks. And we know the key for insurance is to be able to diversify away those shocks by getting together with people that or countries that will not likely face the same shocks at the same time. So, for instance, if you are just a few countries in the Caribbean, it's very likely that if a very large hurricane comes, that all of them will be affected. So they maybe should get together with other countries that will not be suffering from the same shock at the same time. So I think this is something we say in the report, that regional agreements are okay, but they have limitations. And
like at the community level, there's limitations of insurance, and also at the regional level if you're facing the same shock.
It is the same concept.
So a very interesting question that came in is, many of the risks that we discussed today are, to some extent, can be anticipated. We know, we can get information about these risks. So the question is how to prepare for unexpected or unknown risks. What systems can we have in place?
Well, I think again, there is no easy answer to this, but there are a lot of things that are useful, whatever the shock that hit you. The ability to scale up safety nets to help a population that has been affected by a shock is something that's useful for a financial or economic crisis, for a big flood, for a chemical factory incident. That's this ability to scale up support is something that's useful regardless of what kind of shock you're talking about. So it's basically building this capacity is something that's useful even if you don't know exactly all the hazards you're exposed to. Same thing with the ability to manage large-scale evacuations or to provide warning to your population. You might not see it coming, but you might need it for an unexpected type of event. So in the UK and in the Netherlands, these ideas of what they call capabilities, which is some very generic ability to help the population to cope with the shock or to react in terms of crisis management, is something that they have formalized, and they have this series of capabilities that are not related to a given specific risk, but is just good for risk management in general. So I think that's the first answer. And the second answer is, anticipating risk is really important, but we know from a lot of experience, and the Fukushima nuclear incident in Japan is one example, that in the way we manage the crisis, we have to keep some flexibility, because we know that we cannot anticipate everything, and we have to put in place processes to make sure the response is not only based on what we have anticipated, but keep this flexibility and this ability to react to unexpected things. So I think the report discusses this a little bit, and how to implement that in practice. The last point I want to make on this is how we need to learn from what's happening in other places. The way the Netherlands restarted their thinking about flood management after New Orleans is a good example. The way airlines are sharing experience about plane accidents just to make sure if it happens to one, it doesn't happen to the other. All these examples show how much we can learn by just sharing experience. And this type of report we've been doing, and this type of MOOC here, is also, I think, a way to make sure when countries have made progress in how to manage one risk, other countries can benefit from this experience without having to go through the same disaster and the same suffering. So learning, and it's an important role of the international community to make sure this sharing of experience takes place as efficiently as possible.
So I think we need to wrap up soon, but I wanted to end with one question that came from Lanre Rotimi, and it's really going back to the question of, we've discussed so many risks, we've discussed so many obstacles, we've discussed, how can people improve in these situations? And really, we need to make change happen. So, but how is it that change happens, and who can make change happen? So I was thinking about this a bit, and for me, I would place quite a bit of emphasis on information. So it's information about the risks that you face. So we discussed already the example of Bangladesh. By learning more about that hazard, they were able to prepare for it better. Also, information about how your risk is being managed, learning about how to manage that risk better. So this is something that Stefan just mentioned. And for example, in Chile, we know that they really learned from Japan about how to improve their preparation for earthquakes. Sometimes it may be information about what's not being done. So I think you mentioned this already, how civil society can play a role in pointing out failures, and also I think the media can play this role, and this can be an agent of change. And then also I think sort of public action can be quite powerful. So for example, in China, we've seen that a lot of the pressure to improve air pollution standards has come from people in cities really, suffering from that risk. So there's quite some power in that. So I don't think it's easy to overcome these obstacles, but we do see examples of change that happens often from the bottom up rather than from the top down. I don't know if you want to add on this.
I believe that change to be sustainable needs to be advocated and promoted from the household and from the communities. And it needs to be accepted, and it needs to be supplemented by all possible behaviors and resources. But there is a coordinating role from the top down. And that coordinating role falls very much in the hands of the international community and the government. And I think that in many cases, this coordinating role takes the shape of presenting a structure, an organized structure where everyone else can play the role in a proper way. So, for instance, you mentioned the case of Chilean earthquakes. In the report, we highlight how different the two situations in 2011 were between Chile and Haiti. Both suffered from massive earthquakes. In fact, the Chilean earthquake was 500 times stronger than the one in Haiti. Yet the consequences in Chile were a lot less fatal and costly than they were in Haiti. And experts have pointed out one specific reason, and this is that building codes were enforced in the case of Chile, whereas they were not in the case of Haiti. And even though the risk of Haiti, an earthquake in Haiti was low, respecting building codes is something that is good anyway. It's something that Stefan was saying a couple of minutes ago. When you don't know what you will have to face in the future, then certain good practices must be undertaken. And building codes would have prevented massive death in the case of Haiti, and they would have been good policies in any way, in any context.
And if I can maybe add on this, I mean, the problem of risk management, it's a never-ending thing. I mean, we will not have the policy package that solves the problem. When we take care of a risk and implement policies or measures, we're creating new risks that then will need to be managed. So we really have to think about that as just an iterative process where we're always reviewing risks, what can be done about it, acting and just monitoring the results and starting again. So it's really something that is a continuous process of correcting mistakes, making mistakes, and trying to learn out of that. So it's a good domain because it's not a problem that will be solved anytime soon. So it's good to learn about it, I guess. But we have to just refrain from thinking that there is a silver bullet that we will introduce and then everything will be nice and good. We will always have problems in terms of risk management, and we will always have additional things to do.
Good. So I think we have to wrap up, but thank you especially to those who listened in and who sent questions, and to all of you for participating.
Thank you very much.